Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked through his binoculars at the valley below. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains. As a Marine sergeant leading a small reconnaissance patrol, he had seen many dangerous situations, but something felt different about this mission. His team of 8 Marines had been tracking a group of insurgents for 3 days. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy was planning an attack on a nearby village where American forces were helping build a school. The mission seemed straightforward: locate the insurgents, gather information, and call for backup if needed. Private Johnson crouched beside Marcus, adjusting his radio equipment. "Sergeant, I'm getting some chatter on the enemy frequencies. Sounds like they know we're here." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Their position on the hillside had seemed secure, but now he wondered if they had walked into a trap. The rocky outcropping where they had set up their observation post provided good cover, but it also limited their escape routes. Corporal Williams, their best marksman, was positioned 20 meters away with his sniper rifle. He had been watching the valley entrance for any movement. Through his scope, he could see at least 15 armed men moving through the rocks below. What worried him most was that they seemed to be surrounding the hill where his team was hiding. The patrol had left their base camp before dawn, expecting to return by sunset. They carried enough water and ammunition for a day-long mission, nothing more. The plan was simple: observe, report, and return. But plans rarely survive contact with the enemy. Marcus studied the terrain around them. The hill they occupied was like a small island of rocks in a sea of open ground. To the north, a steep cliff dropped into a deep ravine. To the south, the slope was gentler, but offered no cover for at least 200 meters. East and west were blocked by enemy positions. As the sun climbed higher, the temperature began to rise. The Marines could feel the heat reflecting off the rocks around them. Water would become a serious concern if they remained trapped much longer. Private Rodriguez, the youngest member of the patrol, had joined the Marines straight out of high school. This was his first deployment, and his hand shook slightly as he checked his rifle. He had trained for situations like this, but training felt very different from the real thing. The enemy fighters below were well equipped and seemed to know exactly where the Americans were hiding. They moved with confidence, taking positions that would make any escape attempt extremely dangerous. Marcus realized they had been watched for some time, probably since they first entered the valley. Through the radio, Johnson picked up more enemy communications. He didn't speak the local language, but the tone suggested coordination and planning. "Sergeant, they're definitely talking about us. I can hear them positioning their people." Marcus made a difficult decision. He ordered his men to prepare defensive positions among the rocks. They would dig in and wait for an opportunity to escape or for help to arrive. But first, they needed to let their base know what was happening. Johnson worked frantically with the radio, trying to establish contact with headquarters. The mountains often blocked radio signals, making communication difficult. After several attempts, he managed to get through to their base camp. "Base, this is Patrol 7. We are surrounded by enemy forces on Hill 347. Request immediate assistance." Over. The response was clear, but not encouraging. "Patrol 7, we copy your situation. Help is coming, but it will take time to organize. Hold your position and stay low." Marcus knew that help could be hours away. In the meantime, his small team would have to survive against overwhelming odds. The enemy fighters below had patience on their side. They could wait, knowing that time, heat, and limited supplies would work in their favor. As the morning wore on, the situation became more tense. The Marines could see movement in the rocks below as more enemy fighters joined the group. What had started as 15 men was now closer to 30, and they were well armed with rifles and rocket-propelled grenades. Corporal Williams kept his eye on the scope, watching for any target of opportunity. But the enemy fighters were smart, staying behind cover and only exposing themselves for brief moments. A single shot would reveal his position and bring deadly return fire. The heat was becoming unbearable. The Marines had started their mission before dawn when the temperature was cool, but now the sun was directly overhead. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat, and Their water supplies were running low. Private Rodriguez asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Sergeant, what's the plan?" Marcus had been thinking the same thing. They were outnumbered 4-1, surrounded on all sides, and running out of time. Their only advantages were their training, their discipline, and the hope that help would arrive before it was too late. "We wait," Marcus replied. "We stay alert, conserve our ammunition, and wait for our chance." But as he spoke those words, Marcus wondered if that chance would ever come. The enemy had chosen their position well, and they seemed content to wait. The Marines were trapped like animals in a cage, and the hunters were closing in. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the rocks. The Marines took turns keeping watch while others tried to rest in whatever shade they could find. But rest was difficult when death could come from any direction at any moment. Johnson continued monitoring the radio, hoping for word that help was on the way. But the static-filled silence was almost as frightening as the enemy voices he had heard earlier. As evening approached, Marcus realized they might have to spend the night on the hill. The thought was terrifying. In darkness, the enemy could move closer without being seen. The Marines would be fighting blind against an enemy who knew the terrain perfectly. The sun was setting behind the western mountains when they heard the first shot echo across the valley. It came from the north, from a ridge that seemed empty and abandoned. The shot was followed by shouting from the enemy positions below. Marcus looked through his binoculars toward the sound, but could see nothing except rocks and shadows. Who had fired that shot? Were there other American forces in the area? Or was this some kind of trap? The questions raced through his mind as darkness began to fall over the valley. Whatever was happening on that distant ridge, it had changed the situation dramatically. The enemy fighters below were no longer focused solely on the Marines' position. Hope flickered in Marcus's chest for the first time all day. Maybe, just maybe, help had arrived from an unexpected direction. The shot from the ridge changed everything in an instant. Marcus watched through his binoculars as confusion spread through the enemy positions below. The insurgents who had been calmly waiting for hours were now scrambling for cover, unsure where the threat was coming from. Another shot rang out from the same direction, followed by a cry from one of the enemy fighters. Someone on that ridge was an excellent marksman, picking off targets with deadly precision. But who could it be? Johnson pressed his radio headset closer to his ear, trying to pick up any American communications. "Sergeant, I'm not hearing anything from our people. Base says all friendly forces are accounted for." This was puzzling and worrying. If it wasn't American forces firing from the ridge, then who was helping them? Marcus had heard stories of local fighters who opposed the insurgents, but encounters with them were rare and often unpredictable. Corporal Williams adjusted his scope toward the ridge where the shots were coming from. The distance was considerable, at least 800 meters across the valley. Even with his powerful scope, he could barely make out movement among the rocks. "I see muzzle flashes," Williams whispered. "Definitely a single shooter. Professional grade, rifle by the sound of it. This guy knows what he's doing." The enemy fighters below were in chaos now. They had been expecting to deal with 8 trapped Marines, not a sniper attack from an unexpected direction. Several of their men were down, and the others were trying to reorganize while staying under cover. Marcus saw an opportunity developing. The enemy's attention was divided now. Half of them were still watching his position, but the others had turned toward the ridge. If his team was going to make a move, this might be their only chance. Private Rodriguez was lying flat behind a large boulder, his rifle ready. Despite his fear, he had maintained discipline throughout the long day. "Sergeant, are we going to make a run for it?" "Not yet," Marcus replied. "Let's see how this plays out." The mysterious sniper on the ridge continued his deadly work. Each shot was carefully aimed and devastating in its effect. The insurgents were discovering that their superior numbers meant nothing if they couldn't identify and eliminate the threat. As darkness fell, the situation became even more confusing for the enemy. The sniper had the advantage of knowing exactly where they were positioned, while they could only guess at his location. The muzzle flashes from his rifle appeared and disappeared like deadly fireflies in the night. Johnson suddenly grabbed Marcus's arm. "Sergeant, I'm picking up a transmission. It's not on our frequency, but it's in English. Marcus took the radio headset and listened carefully. Through the static, he could hear a calm, deep voice speaking with a slight accent. American Patrol, this is Falcon. I am in position on the North Ridge. Enemy forces are divided. Recommend you prepare to move on my signal. Marcus was stunned. Who was this Falcon? How did he know about their situation? And why was he helping them? He keyed the radio and responded cautiously. Falcon, this is Patrol 7. Identify yourself. Who are you? The response came immediately. Questions later, Sergeant. Right now, I suggest you listen carefully. In 10 minutes, I will create a distraction on the eastern slope. When you hear 3 rapid shots, move west toward the ravine. There is a path down the cliff face about 50 meters from your current position. Marcus looked toward the cliff to the west. In daylight, it had seemed impossible to climb down. But in darkness, with the enemy distracted, it might be their only escape route. Falcon, how do you know about the path? Because I used it to get here 3 hours ago. Trust me, Sergeant, your men are running out of time. Marcus realized that whoever this mysterious ally was, he had been planning their rescue for hours. But that raised more questions. How had he known they were trapped? How had he gotten into position without being detected by either the Marines or the insurgents? Corporal Williams was studying the western cliff through his scope. Sergeant, I can see what might be a path. It's narrow and dangerous, but it could work. The 10 minutes passed slowly. Marcus briefed his men on the escape plan, knowing they would have to move quickly and silently once the opportunity came. Private Rodriguez checked his equipment one last time, his hands steadier now that action was finally at hand. Johnson monitored both American and enemy frequencies, trying to piece together what was happening. The insurgents were clearly frustrated and confused. Their leader was shouting orders, but the men seemed reluctant to move into the open where the sniper could pick them off. Then the signal came. 3 rapid shots echoed across the valley, followed by shouting from the eastern slope. The shots had come from a different position, making the insurgents think the sniper had moved. Go, 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 Marcus whispered urgently. The 8 Marines moved like shadows toward the western edge of their rocky outcrop. The cliff face was intimidating, but they could see the narrow path that their mysterious ally had mentioned. It was barely wide enough for one person at a time. Williams went first, his sniper rifle slung across his back. The path was treacherous, with loose rocks that could easily give way. One wrong step would mean a fatal fall into the ravine below. Rodriguez followed, his heart pounding as he felt for handholds in the darkness. Behind him, the other Marines moved as quietly as possible, knowing that any noise could alert the enemy to their escape attempt. Marcus brought up the rear, constantly looking back to make sure they weren't being followed. The distraction on the eastern slope seemed to be working. He could hear the insurgents moving in that direction, away from their escape route. Halfway down the cliff face, disaster almost struck. A loose rock gave way under Johnson's foot, sending a shower of stones into the ravine below. The noise seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. The Marines froze, pressed against the rock face, waiting to see if they had been discovered. For long seconds, they heard nothing except their own breathing. Then, movement resumed on the eastern slope, suggesting the enemy hadn't noticed the sound. At the bottom of the ravine, the Marines regrouped quickly. They were in a narrow valley filled with boulders and scrub vegetation. It provided good cover, but they were still far from safety. Johnson checked his radio for instructions from their mysterious ally. The voice came through clearly now that they were at the bottom of the valley. Well done, Patrol 7. Follow the ravine north for 200 meters. There's a vehicle waiting. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. A vehicle? Who are you, Falcon? Someone who has been watching this valley for a long time. Someone who knows these mountains better than the insurgents do. Move quickly, Sergeant. They will discover your escape route soon. The Marines moved through the ravine as fast as they dared. The terrain was difficult, with loose rocks and hidden obstacles that could easily cause an injury. But they were motivated by the knowledge that enemy fighters were still searching for them above. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached the vehicle. It was an old pickup truck, battered and dusty, hidden beneath camouflage netting in a small side canyon. Standing beside the truck was a tall man in local clothing, but carrying a modern sniper rifle. His face was weathered and scarred, and his eyes held the look of someone who had seen too much war. "I am Abdul," he said in accented English. "Former Afghan army sniper. My village was destroyed by those men you were watching. My family was killed." Marcus understood immediately. This man had his own reasons for fighting the insurgents. The enemy of his enemy had become a temporary ally. "We need to get out of here," Abdul continued. "They will find the path soon, and there are more of them coming from the east." As if to emphasize his point, gunfire erupted from the direction of the cliff they had just descended. The insurgents had discovered their escape route and were firing blindly into the ravine. Abdul started the truck's engine, which coughed and wheezed, but finally caught. "Get in. We have a long drive ahead of us." The 8 Marines climbed into the back of the pickup, grateful to be moving away from immediate danger. But Marcus knew their ordeal was far from over. They were in unfamiliar territory, dependent on a man they had just met, with enemy forces still searching for them. As the truck bounced along a barely visible mountain track, Marcus radioed their base to report their status. The response was immediate relief, followed by instructions to reach a predetermined extraction point 20 kilometers away. But 20 kilometers might as well have been 20,000. The mountains were full of insurgent fighters, and the old truck was not built for speed. They would have to rely on Abdul's knowledge of the terrain and hope that their luck would hold just a little longer. The engine coughed again, sputtered, and died. In the sudden silence, they could hear vehicles in the distance, growing closer. Abdul tried the ignition again, but the old truck refused to start. The engine made a grinding noise and fell silent. In the distance, the sound of vehicles was getting closer, along with the occasional shout in a local dialect. "Everyone out," Marcus ordered quietly. "We move on foot from here." Abdul grabbed his sniper rifle and a small backpack from the truck's cab. "The extraction point is still 15 kilometers away," he said grimly. "But I know a route through the mountains that they cannot follow with vehicles." The Marines gathered their equipment and followed Abdul into the rocky terrain above the road. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making the darkness almost complete. They had to feel their way carefully over loose stones and around large boulders. Private Rodriguez stumbled and nearly fell, catching himself at the last moment. The young Marine was exhausted after the long day of tension and the dangerous climb down the cliff. But he kept moving, knowing that stopping could mean death for all of them. Behind them, the pursuing vehicles reached the abandoned truck. Voices shouted commands, and flashlights swept the area. The insurgents had found their trail and would soon be following on foot. Abdul led the group up a steep path that seemed to exist only in his memory. The Marines trusted him because they had no choice, but Marcus wondered if they were being led into another trap. The man had saved them once, but desperation could make anyone unpredictable. Corporal Williams brought up the rear of the group, his sniper rifle ready. Every few minutes, he would stop and listen for sounds of pursuit. The insurgents were following, but they were moving slowly in the darkness, apparently unfamiliar with this particular mountain trail. After an hour of climbing, Abdul called for a brief rest. The Marines collapsed gratefully behind a cluster of large rocks that provided concealment from below. Their water was almost gone, and the physical exertion was taking its toll. Johnson tried to raise their base on the radio, but the mountains continued to block most transmissions. He managed to get through briefly, reporting their position and requesting helicopter extraction at the planned coordinates. "Negative on helicopter support," came the crackling response. "Weather is moving in. Extraction will be by ground convoy at first light." Marcus felt his heart sink. First light was still 6 hours away, and they had 15 kilometers of dangerous mountain terrain to cover. With enemy forces pursuing them and no air support available, their chances of reaching safety seemed slim. Abdul seemed to read his thoughts. "There's another way," he said quietly. "Dangerous, but faster. An old mining road that cuts through the high pass." It is mostly abandoned, but some sections are very narrow. How narrow? Marcus asked. Wide enough for one person at a time, with a cliff on one side and a rock wall on the other. If we were caught there, Marcus understood, they would be trapped again, but this time with no escape route. However, staying on the current path meant certain confrontation with their pursuers. What's your recommendation? He asked Abdul. The former Afghan soldier studied the terrain ahead, then looked back toward the sounds of pursuit. The mining road. If we can reach it before they catch up, we can be at the extraction point in 3 hours instead of 6. It was a gamble, but Marcus realized they were out of safe options. Lead the way. The group moved out again, following Abdul up an even steeper trail. The rocks were loose here, and every step risked starting a small avalanche that would reveal their position. Private Rodriguez slipped and skinned his knee badly, but kept moving without complaint. The mining road, when they reached it, was exactly as Abdul had described. It had been carved into the side of the mountain, probably decades earlier. On the right side was solid rock rising straight up. On the left was empty space falling into darkness. The path was barely wide enough for one person, and the surface was uneven with loose gravel. One misstep would mean a fatal fall, but it did lead in the direction they needed to go, winding around the mountain toward their extraction point. Abdul went first, testing each step carefully before putting his full weight on it. The Marines followed in single file, each man responsible for the safety of the one behind him. Conversation was impossible. All their attention was focused on not falling. Halfway across the most dangerous section, disaster struck. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the mountain walls. The insurgents had reached the beginning of the mining road and were shooting at the group, even though the range was extreme and accuracy was nearly impossible in the darkness. The bullets struck the rock wall beside them, sending fragments flying. One piece of stone cut Marcus across the cheek, drawing blood. The Marines pressed themselves against the rock wall and tried to move faster. Corporal Williams found a slightly wider section of the path and set up his rifle. The pursuing insurgents were using flashlights, making themselves easy targets. His first shot extinguished one light and sent the others scrambling for cover. Keep moving, Williams called to the others. I'll slow them down. But Williams knew he couldn't hold them for long. He had limited ammunition, and the enemy had overwhelming numbers. After firing 3 more carefully aimed shots, he packed up his rifle and hurried to catch up with the group. The mining road seemed to go on forever, winding back and forth across the mountainside. The Marines' legs ached from the constant tension of walking on the narrow, unstable surface. Several times, sections of the path had crumbled away completely, forcing them to find handholds on the rock face and inch across the gaps. Johnson, carrying the heavy radio equipment, was having the most difficulty. The extra weight threw off his balance, and he was falling behind the others. Marcus made the difficult decision to abandon some of their gear to help Johnson keep up. As they rounded another curve in the mining road, Abdul suddenly stopped. Ahead of them, the path was completely blocked by a landslide. Tons of rock and dirt had fallen from above, making the road impassable. "We have to go back," Rodriguez said, panic creeping into his voice. "No," Abdul replied firmly. "There is another way. Below the slide, there is an old tunnel. It was used to store mining equipment. If it is still open, we can get through." Getting to the tunnel meant leaving the relative safety of the mining road and climbing down a steep, rocky slope in complete darkness. But the alternative was going back toward the pursuing insurgents. Abdul led them down the treacherous slope, feeling for handholds and testing each step. The tunnel entrance was partially hidden by fallen rocks, but it was open. The Marines followed Abdul into the musty darkness, leaving the mountain air behind. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing them to crouch as they moved. The air was stale and difficult to breathe. Worse, they had no idea where the tunnel led or if there was another exit. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they saw light ahead. The tunnel emerged on the other side of the landslide, back onto the mining road. They had bypassed the obstacle, but they had also used up precious time. Behind them, muffled by the tunnel, they could hear their pursuers arguing about whether to follow them into the underground passage. Most of the insurgents seemed reluctant to enter the dark tunnel, unsure what might be waiting for them inside. The Marines emerged from the tunnel exhausted and filthy, but grateful to breathe fresh air again. The extraction point was now less than 5 kilometers away, and the eastern sky was beginning to show the first hint of dawn. Abdul checked his watch. 1 hour until first light. The convoy should be waiting for you. As they continued along the mining road, the path gradually widened and became more stable. Eventually, it connected with a dirt road that led down into a valley where American forces had established a temporary checkpoint. Marcus could see vehicle lights in the distance and hear the rumble of diesel engines. The convoy had arrived early and was waiting for them. For the first time in almost 24 hours, he allowed himself to believe they were going to survive. As they approached the checkpoint, American soldiers came out to meet them. Marcus identified himself and his patrol, then turned to thank Abdul for his help. But the Afghan sniper had already melted back into the rocks, disappearing as quietly as he had first appeared. The Marines were loaded into armored vehicles for the trip back to their base. As the convoy moved through the early morning landscape, Marcus reflected on their incredible escape. They had been saved by a man they had never met, someone who had his own reasons for fighting, but who had chosen to help American soldiers in their moment of greatest need. Johnson managed to establish clear radio contact with their base and reported that all 8 members of Patrol 7 were safe and accounted for. The relief in the radio operator's voice was obvious, even through the static. As the sun rose over the mountains, Marcus looked back one more time toward the ridge where Abdul had made his first shot. The mysterious sniper was gone, but somewhere in those mountains, he was probably still fighting his own war against the insurgents who had destroyed his village and killed his family. The patrol reached their base without further incident. They were debriefed, examined by medics, and finally allowed to rest. But Marcus knew that none of them would ever forget the man who had appeared from nowhere to save their lives. In his official report, Marcus wrote about the tactical situation, the enemy forces they had encountered, and the successful extraction of his patrol. But he also wrote about Abdul, the unknown ally who had turned a desperate situation into a successful mission. The story of Patrol 7 and their mysterious savior spread through the base and eventually reached higher command levels. Efforts were made to locate Abdul and offer him assistance, but he was never found. Like many of the local fighters who opposed the insurgents, he preferred to work alone and in secret. Private Rodriguez, no longer the frightened young Marine who had shaken with fear on the hillside, went on to complete his deployment and serve with distinction. The experience had changed him, teaching him that help could come from unexpected places and that courage could be found even in the darkest moments. Corporal Williams continued to serve as a sniper, but he never forgot the lesson of that night. That the most important shot wasn't always the one that hit the target, but sometimes the one that came from someone willing to risk everything to help strangers in need. The ridge where Abdul had made his stand was designated on military maps as Falcon Ridge, in honor of the man who had saved 8 American lives. Sometimes, other patrols reported seeing muzzle flashes from that ridge when insurgents threatened American or Afghan government forces in the area. But Abdul himself remained a ghost, a legend whispered among soldiers who served in those mountains. He had appeared when he was needed most, changed the course of a desperate battle, and then vanished back into the landscape he knew better than anyone. Marcus never saw Abdul again, but he never stopped looking for him. In every valley, on every ridge, he hoped to catch a glimpse of the man who had saved his patrol. And sometimes in the distance, he thought he could hear the echo of that first shot that had thundered from the Forsaken Ridge and changed everything.